Hello, I'm Steve Balch, Director of the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization here at Texas Tech, and I want to welcome you to another edition of Institute Encounters, in which we have talks with the various guests who come to give lectures under the Institute's auspices. This week we've been having a series of sponsored lectures about probably the greatest figure in the history of world literature. Also, stepping one down, the greatest figure in the history of Western literature, and certainly stepping one more down, the greatest figure by all accounts and totally uncontested, I think, in the history of English literature, William Shakespeare, a man who has molded the way in which we think and speak, and whose writings not only are of incomparable poetic value, but also convey all sorts of deep lessons about human nature, about politics, and about the human situation and predicament. And to talk about that, we're very privileged to have here one of the country's most distinguished Shakespearean scholars, Paul Cantor. Dr. Cantor is Clifton Barrett Professor of English at the University of Virginia. He's the author of numerous books and articles which span a broad range of interests: Shakespeare, popular culture, evolution and popular culture, and finally Austrian economics, a side of him that I didn't realize was intellectually active until we had a chance to kind of meet this week and talk about it all. His most recent book is Shakespeare's Roman Trilogy, The Twilight of the Ancient World, and just to sort of give you another example of a recent book that combines his interest in Austrian economics with that of popular culture, The Invisible Hand in Popular Culture, Liberty and Authority in American Film and TV. Well, welcome to us here at Texas Tech. We're delighted to have you. I hope you're having a good time. You're as well known, I think, among students of political theory as you are among students of Shakespeare. You're very well known in both circles, but that's an interesting distinction. What is it that has interested you with respect to political theory about Shakespeare and his works?
Well, I think it's clear that politics is a central issue for Shakespeare. If you look at his tragic figures, they're all somehow prominently political. Even Romeo and Juliet are from prominent aristocratic families, and what happens to them affects the whole city of Verona. And so, just from the point of view of understanding Shakespeare, you have to look at the political aspects of the play, and the more I've studied them, I see that Shakespeare sees politics as a central and defining human activity. And, for example, I showed that he couldn't understand these Roman characters he creates without understanding something about Rome, its political layout, the issue of what the Roman Republic was like, that sort of thing.
And he seems to have a theory about how the Roman Republic declined and the significance of what replaced it. That seems to be the sort of central thesis of your Roman Republic
yes,
book.
And
Tell us about that.
He's in a long tradition of doing so. Mm-hmm. You find it already in the ancient world with thinkers like Polybius. It's an issue that preoccupied Machiavelli, went on to be of concern to Montesquieu, and so I see him as in a long line of thinkers who are interested in the difference between republic and empire as regimes, and specifically the great change from republic to empire in Roman history, so that of the three mature Roman plays that I've written about, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, and Antony Cleopatra, very interesting that the first one Shakespeare wrote chronologically, Julius Caesar, is about the moment when the Roman Republic is on its last legs, and Julius Caesar is in the process of restoring one-man rule in Rome. A conspiracy forms against him to restore the Republic, but it fails, and then in Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare effectively shows the emergence of the Roman Empire. I believe he also chose then to go back to the very beginnings of the Roman Republic in this play Coriolanus, which is set shortly after the Romans overthrew their foreign kings, these Etruscan, Tarquin kings, but it's set at that moment when the distinctive aspect of the Roman Republic came into being, namely when the people got this tribunate. They got the right to appoint what we would call their representatives, these tribunes, who had the power to veto anything the Senate did. So Shakespeare was very interested in the nature of this Roman Republic, which was thought of as, it was called a mixed regime in antiquity. It combined elements of monarchic, aristocratic, and popular or democratic rule. The Roman Republic had two consuls who were essentially the chief executives. That meant then mainly being the generals of the Roman armies. It had a Senate, which passed the legislation and had many other functions. And then you had these tribunes of the people who spoke up for them, and in particular had the right to block anything the Senate passed. It looks ridiculous on paper, and by the way, it wasn't written down, but it worked. And it worked for about 450 years. It's always in some ways a puzzle. How did such a ragtag, hodgepodge political arrangement work? It fascinated Machiavelli, his discourses on Livy, a commentary on the great Roman historian Livy. Consider this, and you really get in Machiavelli the first argument for a dynamic regime in which the conflicts among the elements actually energize the community. And so Shakespeare's does a rather complex analysis of how the Roman Republic worked in Coriolanus, and then he did understand, as so many other people have, that the Republic was eventually corrupted by its own success. Now, it lasted 450 years, which is not bad. That's double the United States' regime at this point. But still, over the years, Rome expanded. It, in a way, got corrupted by its increasing wealth, got corrupted by its encounters with other nations. Rome was very adaptive and often adopted the customs or various other aspects of the civilizations.
But what impressed, it seems to me, from what you say in your book, what impressed Shakespeare most about the early Roman Republic was the total claim that it had on its citizens and the ideal of total devotion to the city that its leading citizens express. That's what he sort of sees as exemplary about
Yes, and partially because of the extremely limited alternatives. Shakespeare was aware that Rome had a civic religion, that the gods of the city were the gods of Rome. There was no idea of an afterlife. For an ambitious man who wanted to become immortal, the way to become immortal was not some afterlife, but gaining a name as a great Roman conqueror. And the small size of the city gave it a great deal of power over its citizens. Shakespeare suggests that the Roman Republic had very narrow horizons. For example, in Coriolanus, it's very unusual, there's no love interest, as there usually is, and above all in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. That's a great way of seeing the contrast between the Republic and the Empire. The Republic focused intensely on war. I mean, it's why the Roman Republic conquered the entire Mediterranean world, and there's very little else in the city, whereas what Shakespeare shows by Julius Caesar, the Romans have conquered the Greeks, and now they're interested in Greek things. Rome is being Hellenized. That particularly means they're now interested in Greek philosophy, and that's in a way a very positive development. On the other hand, the Greek philosophies shown in the play Stoicism, Epicureanism, are apolitical, and they tend to lead people to retreat from politics, or if they stay in politics, it's in a moderate way. And then finally, when the empire emerges in Antony and Cleopatra, we see it's a much more erotic community. The whole play is a great play about love, the love of Antony and Cleopatra, and that emerges as a kind of alternative to politics.
So in the game of Coriolanus, And I guess Shakespeare is assuming that for the sake of seeing a high drama, his audiences are willing to do without love affairs in the plays. But when it comes to Coriolanus, if you're not with Rome, the only alternative left is sort of to be against her, to join the other side.
Yes.
It's a kind of Hobbesian world of city versus city, and life really comes down to a kind of struggle.
Yes, and it is ironic that when Coriolanus is banished by the plebeians for his haughty aristocratic manner, and he says there's a world elsewhere, but he just goes over to another city, Antium, and becomes their general. So there doesn't seem to be much alternative in that world to the world of politics.
Now, in the world of Julius Caesar, and in Julius Caesar you see the Republic breaking down around you. In the world of Julius Caesar, there are all sorts of alternatives. People are doing other types of things than being engaged in politics. And what are the evidences that Shakespeare provides for that?
Well, there's the great speech that Julius Caesar gives about Cassius when he says to Mark Antony, Antonius, let me have men about me that are fat, sleek-headed men, and such as sleep o' nights. He loves no plays as thou dost, Antony. And suddenly there's plays, and this is historically true. Caesar was assassinated in the theater of Pompey, which was substituting for the Senate House. And so, yeah, Antony parties. He's a party animal. He loves music. What's breaking down is that intense Republican focus on politics. Cassius is a classic Republican, except that he's an Epicurean. That's an odd touch. It shows even he is being Hellenized.
Why is he involved in politics at all?
Yeah, he shouldn't be if he were an Epicurean. But for example, we now have soothsayers in Rome. It is interesting. We know Shakespeare's source for the Roman plays were Lives by Plutarch. And actually, in Plutarch's Life of Coriolanus, there are soothsayers in Rome. But Shakespeare eliminates that. There's no source of divine authority outside the city. What Shakespeare shows now in Julius Caesar is there's these strange people wandering around who claim to have some kind of religious authority independent of the city. That was not possible in the world of the Republic. By the time of Antony and Cleopatra, everybody's got his own personal soothsayer. Antony doesn't travel without a soothsayer around. And that shows something that people are beginning to think in terms of their personal fortune. Not that their fortune is completely bound up with the fortune of Rome. Studying the sources is very useful. And in Plutarch's Life of Coriolanus, strange events happen in the heavens. There are all sorts of these supernatural signs. Shakespeare omits that. But in Julius Caesar, there's that big scene, it's in Act 2, when strange things appear in the sky. People draw conclusions from it about the future of Rome. And again, Antony and Cleopatra is filled with people who have visions that go beyond the city.
So another facet that kind of holds Coriolanus and Julius Caesar together is the presence of the plebs. You don't really see any plebs in Antony and Cleopatra.
Oh, right, and that's a fascinating...
Are the plebs different in Julius
absolutely.
Caesar than in Coriolanus?
Absolutely, and this is one of my best pieces of evidence for the idea that this is an artfully constructed trilogy. That is, in Coriolanus, which again was written later, but it opens with a scene where the plebs are at their absolute limit. They're starving to death. They are rebelling in order to get food. Oddly enough, they accept a political gesture, getting the tribunes rather than actual food. Now, what Shakespeare shows in Julius Caesar is a very prosperous group of plebeians now. They are still plebeians, but they have trades. They're identified as citizens in Coriolanus. In Julius Caesar, one's a cobbler. They have profession, and they're on holiday. Hence, idle creatures. Their own tribunes say to them. In Coriolanus, it's the very earliest days of the Roman Republic, the people are under the pressure of necessity, and that's something that keeps them in line.
Do they have virtue in Coriolanus?
Well, yes. For example, they do serve in the army, and they serve well when they have a good general commanding them. What we see in Julius Caesar is that urban mob that we associate with the Roman Empire. Now, again, this is just before the official empire, but you can see that Caesar and his henchman Mark Antony have already instituted the what we call the bread and circuses policy of the Roman emperors. I mean, the big thing that wins the plebeians over in Julius Caesar is when Antony tells them Caesar's left them 75 drachmas in his will. I like to say, that's the price of Roman freedom, 75 drachmas. Then give them 75 drachmas, and they will give up their old role in the regime. In fact, one thing we see at the opening of Julius Caesar is the tribunes have turned on the people because they are now rushing after Julius Caesar. They admire him, they want him to rule the city, and that's really when the Republic is doomed. And it is
they're putting crowns on the statues, aren't they?
No, like they are. The tribunes are tearing scars off the statues of Caesar, and Mark Antony. There's that scene that Casca relates that Mark Antony offered Caesar a crown, and when he heard the people boo, he backed off. And by the way, Casca narrating it says, if the tag rag people did not hoot him as they used to do the players in the theater, and politics becomes theatrical in the empire. It's something that Shakespeare shows very carefully. Coriolanus refuses to be...
But the tribunes who represent the people seem to accuse the people of being insufficiently Republican.
Exactly.
They're afraid the people are kind of straying after this demagogue.
Yes, exactly. And they're doing it because Caesar is good to them. He gives them free grain, that sort of thing. And it is interesting that their last gasp is they effectively adjudicate between Marcus Brutus and Mark Antony as to who was right in this matter of assassinating Caesar, and the people essentially vote for Antony. They then become a mob and kill some poor sinner, the poet, because he has the same name, one of the conspirators, and the plebeians never appear again on stage. Acts 4 and 5 of Julius Caesar, or in any place in Antony Cleopatra.
So when the plebeians kill Cinna, they do it after learning that he's not the Cinna they're interested in.
Kill him
they want to kill him anyway for his bad verses.
Kill him for his bad verses.
Is that a little in-joke?
Yeah, I do think that Shakespeare shows something about Rome that way.
The champions of republicanism in Julius Caesar are not the plebs, though the tribunes seem to be on the right side. It's the conspirators who are aristocrats.
Yes.
And Brutus particularly.
Yes.
And how does Shakespeare portray those characters as the champions of the waning republic?
Well, the interesting thing is they have noble motives and self-serving motives, both Brutus and Cassius. You really see these are the sort of men who made the Republic work. They are ambitious but willing to share power. And indeed their complaint about Caesar is not that he has power, but that he's monopolized power. And Cassius says, when has there ever been a time when there was one man in Rome? So in the case of Brutus, he is a lineal descendant of the Junius Brutus, who in effect created the Republic, led the rebellion against the Tarquin kings. Brutus has a sense of his lineage and wants to live up to it. But the interesting thing that Shakespeare shows about Brutus is he is obsessed with leading the conspiracy. In fact, all the mistakes the conspiracy makes are made by Brutus over Cassius's objection. For example, Cassius proposes having Cicero join the conspiracy, and since in the end the whole issue turned on speeches and who could most convincingly speak to the people, Cicero was the greatest orator in Rome and presumably would have given a better speech than Brutus did. But Brutus says no, Cicero will not join anything that he does not himself lead. Now, why is that an objection unless Brutus is going to insist that he's leading the conspiracy? And indeed, every time Cassius says the right thing, we gotta kill Antony. We mustn't let, if we don't kill him, we mustn't let him speak at the funeral. Brutus overrules him. The way I was taught this play in junior high school, Brutus was all good and Cassius was all evil. And indeed, Cassius is the one that seems sneaky and mean-spirited and doing this out of envy of Caesar and so on. And yet, he is the kind of person you need in a conspiracy, and he is rather generous to Brutus. Now, he needs Brutus for what we call PR. Brutus has a reputation for nobility, and the thought is if he's with the conspiracy, the people will respect the conspiracy. So much of what Cassius does is machination. Indeed, it's rather interesting. One of the things that Cassius does is spread fake news. He manufactures these petitions from the people to Brutus saying, restore the Republic and so on. And in fact, it is interesting, as I've thought about that, that may be responsible for Brutus's overestimation of his standing in the community. And the fact that he isn't, sort of backfires on Cassius. The fact that Brutus isn't cautious enough about Mark Antony may flow from the campaign that Cassius engineered. So I think, as always in Shakespeare, he sees both sides of all his characters. He doesn't see people as all virtuous or all evil. He understands.
There are a few.
Well, okay, we can get into an argument about that, but
Richard III, Iago.
Well, they have many admirable qualities, but in the case of these conspirators, they are flawed human beings. I mean, they have all too human motives, but they also have noble motives, and I think Shakespeare understands that about nobility, that to some extent nobles are a show. They're putting on a show, but there's still something there that their desire to put on a show makes them lift themselves up to a certain level, and Brutus and Cassius thought they were striking a blow for the freedom and independence and the self-governing power of the Roman aristocracy.
So some would say that Julius Caesar, the tragedy of Julius Caesar, is really the tragedy of Brutus.
Yeah.
That he's the tragic character.
Yeah.
When he's lying there dead and Octavian comes in, he says, well, this was the noblest Roman.
Anthony says that.
Anthony says that. This was the noblest Roman of them all. Does Shakespeare see him, of course, a flawed figure to be sure, but a sort of fellow who's outlived his time, who was more representative of the Republic in its glory days, or not?
Well, first of all, I think these plays are the tragedy of Rome itself. That's the thesis of the book, and that Rome is a kind of tragic figure whose very greatness leads to its own downfall. And so I don't think we have to say that, I think Cassius is a tragic figure, and Julius Caesar is a tragic figure. I don't think it's just an accident that it's named Julius Caesar. Shakespeare presents Julius Caesar as obviously a very great man, because the most Cassius is willing to say is, he's not that great. He's not a god, but the premise of that is he's pretty impressive. And of course, all his conquests are in the background. And he too is a flawed figure in the way his tragedy is. He's outlived his time. He's reached a point where he's accomplished everything he wanted to do. And the only thing he has left to do is to destroy the very institution that gave him honor, namely the Republic. And yeah, I don't think Shakespeare has a sense of historical inevitability, by which I mean it's not clear that Brutus outlived his time, because this conspiracy might have worked, because we see the errors they make. And if they kill Antony, or if at a minimum they don't let him speak, or at a very minimum they make him speak first so they can answer him, or they enlist Cicero in the conspiracy, he ended up giving many great speeches against Mark Antony. They're called his Philippics. So it might have worked. Now, it is true, the most chilling moment comes when Brutus is giving his speech, and the crowd is impressed they're on his side, and one of them says, "Let him be Caesar," and that does suggest the Republic is doomed.
The culture, civic culture, is too corrupt.
Yes, and they want one-man rule. They want to be subject, provided they get the bread in the circuses. And this is a subject of debate in antiquity. It's a subject of debate since. Could the Republic have been restored? Probably not. You had almost 100 years of unending civil war, and Marius and Sulla and Pompey and one caudillo after another running Rome. And there is a sense that Brutus is living in the past, underscored by the fact that he's identifying with an ancestor from 450 years earlier.
So if Brutus is yesterday's man, one would say, perhaps in both Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra, that Octavian is the coming man. And how does he compare as a character to Brutus, say?
Well,
more interesting, I think, than how he compares to Antony. How does he compare to Brutus?
Well, he's obviously not as noble. He's called the universal landlord in Antony and Cleopatra, and I got a little nervous if I was thinking the term anachronistically, that maybe landlord was a way of talking about noble. But no, landlord meant landlord in Shakespeare's day, so that's a good characterization of him. He's an administrator, and we see that. I mean, Antony's charge against him is he doesn't lead his troops into battle, and Antony says, I can beat him in single combat and all that. So Octavius is a major step down in terms of nobility, just in terms of physical courage, which is such an outstanding quality of, say, Coriolanus.
Or Caesar.
Or Caesar, for that matter. And, you can say that Octavius is the man for the time. We know this from what happened. He was a superb administrator, and of course was a deceiver. He never claimed to be changing the Republic. He claimed to be restoring it. And we don't realize it now, but emperor was a euphemism. It meant leader of the army, it like commander-in-chief. So when he called himself imperator, that was, I'm not a king, I'm just the imperator. Of course, it's come to mean a higher title now. And again, historically, we know that Octavius did everything he did to conceal the changes. He kept the Senate, for example, kept the tribunes. He just had himself made tribune.
How does he come across on the plays?
No, now of course he's very young, and in some ways that makes him extraordinary for doing so well when he is young. He comes across as cold, so that in the new erotic world of the empire, he doesn't party. He gets drunk a bit in the big shipboard Egyptian bacchanal scene. So it is significant, I think, that even the cold-blooded Octavius is slipping into these new foreign ways. But by and large, he's very clever. He was in a very difficult position. Antony was much older, an established soldier, had the reputation as a soldier, and Octavius outmaneuvers him. And I think he is definitely seen as of this new generation of an ignoble group of emperors that's going to emerge. And Shakespeare is very negative on the empire, more so than he needed to be. But he's in a tradition there. John Milton's portrayal of the empire in Paradise Lost is very negative. Jonathan Swift gives a very negative portrait of it in Gulliver's Travels. And I cite them in my book to show that, again, Shakespeare was part of a tradition of regarding the empire as the great falling off, that the Republic was Rome. Just the way at the end of Julius Caesar, so many of characters are saying, you're the last of all the Romans. No, you're the last of all the Romans. And the sun of Rome is set. That's where I get my subtitle, The Twilight of the Ancient World. That there's a strong sense in Julius Caesar that with the end of the Republic, that is the end of Rome. And again, that is a widespread opinion among political philosophers, but I think Shakespeare goes along with that. It's hard to warm up to Octavius.
You kind of think, though, that even though he fails in his conflict with Octavius, that Antony is sort of a prototype of a new man as well.
Yes, and it's complicated. For one thing, he is turning towards erotic life as an alternative to the noble life of the Republic, but he wants to redefine nobility. Some of his earliest words are, "The nobleness of life is to do thus," and presumably kisses Cleopatra that moment. And he's looking to redefine nobility so it now is in terms of love. And it really suggests a whole transformation of Roman values going on in the play.
Now, did Shakespeare seriously think that that was what Antony was about, or is he using Antony as a symbol for something else?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, Antony certainly, in the life as we know of him, represented a major erotic turn. But I think what Shakespeare is covertly dealing with the play is in effect the rise of Christianity in Rome. That Antony, with his Egyptian longings, represents a turn by Rome to a mystery religion coming out of the East. And I go through the play and show in what ways Roman nobility is being redefined. So, for example, even Octavius, at the end of Antony Cleopatra, says the words, "O noble weakness." And that's a remarkable phrase. It's what we call an oxymoron in my business, a phrase in which the adjective contradicts the noun. Nobody goes around in Coriolanus calling weakness noble, but it points in the new revaluation of Roman values that occurs in the empire that eventually leads to Constantine adopting Christianity as the state religion. Now this new claim that weakness is strength, that death is life, that defeat is victory. Shakespeare is very systematic in showing how the Roman values get inverted.
It's a pretty breathtaking claim to say that Shakespeare equates an Egyptian mystery cult out of Isis with Christianity. I mean, Christianity, after all, in his time, was the revelation of God, and not Egyptian at all. I mean, it came from other sources, from an exodus from Egypt, among other things. Does that call Shakespeare's own Christianity into question? That he can make that equation?
Frankly, I think it does, but it needn't. Let me put it that way. I mean, there's a lot of scholarship. Franz Cumont would be an example. His work on Oriental religions and Roman paganism. I think many people recognize today that Christianity was one of many mystery religions in the East. Mithra was the other one, and Mithra was dead even with Christianity for taking over the Roman Empire at one point. The Roman army was heavily into Mithraism, so that you find Mithraic shrines as far away as London from the Roman army camps. Broadly speaking, what I think Shakespeare shows in Antony Cleopatra, he shows the Hellenization of Rome in Julius Caesar. He shows the Egyptianizing of Rome in Antony Cleopatra, but that's part of a much larger process.
Was he sufficiently aware that the Ptolemies, they had kind of habituated themselves to the cultural milieu of Egypt, were Greeks?
That's somewhat debated, but I don't see how he could have read Plutarch and not known it. And there are scenes in the play where Antony and Cleopatra stage themselves as the kind of Oriental god kings that you get in the wake of the Hellenistic god kings.
But to the extent you see them as Hellenized, rather than Orientalized, I mean, Rome was already Hellenized.
Yes,
so how much of a change then would that really be?
The Orientalism adds the element of the supernatural in it. For example, one of the ways Shakespeare distinguishes his ancient Romans from modern Christians is the attitude towards suicide. Hamlet turns on the fact that Hamlet understands suicide as forbidden to, oh, that the everlasting hath not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. Shakespeare's Romans basically line up to commit suicide. They can't wait when the end is near. And it's almost defining of them. And then yet at the end of Antony Cleopatra, Cleopatra says, then is it sin to sneak into the afterlife or something like that? And indeed it's very prominent at the end that Antony and Cleopatra are both speaking of the afterlife. And I think Shakespeare is showing a broad transformation that occurred around the year 1 throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Hans Jonas has written about this in his book, The Gnostic Religion, for example. There were all sorts of apocalyptic, millennial cults going on at the time, of which Christianity was one. It emerged victorious, largely through Constantine. I mean, Herod of Jewry is mentioned, I think, 3 times in the play. In 2 cases, I think, in at least one case, Shakespeare's substituting Herod for something in his source.
Is that supposed to tip you off?
I think so. I mean, Antony refers to the bulls of Bassan at one point, who come from Psalm 22 in the Old Testament, and Psalm 22 begins, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" There are buried references to the book of Revelations in it. Almost the first thing that Antony and Cleopatra are calling for are new heaven, new earth. I'm not alone in seeing these Christian references in the play. I am more or less alone in seeing a Nietzschean revaluation of all values going along with them.
Mm-hmm. So you have some questions about Shakespeare's Christianity. Tell us more.
Well, as far as in my view, his affinities are greater with the classical world than with the Christian world. Although it is Christianity that ultimately deepens his characters, and you see that in Macbeth, Othello, and Hamlet. I'm really not interested in what Shakespeare's own beliefs were. I think, though, he portrays Christianity in his plays again and again as a deeply complicated and tragic factor in life. You see it in his history plays, where Christianity keeps interfering with politics. You have these bishops and archbishops who intervene in warfare. As I talked about last night in my lecture here, I think the neutralizing of Christianity in political terms was one of his great projects. And of course that succeeded. And beyond that, I think that he understood how Christianity had changed the human condition and did not see that as unproblematic. Let me put it that way. That he saw as a deeply complicated factor. It's what creates Hamlet's tragedy, Macbeth's tragedy. They're torn between a set of ancient pagan values and these newer Christian values. Macbeth, when he's talking to the murderers, trying to get the murderers to kill Banquo, at one point he says, "Are you so gospeled to let him get away with this?" And that's really an interesting line. It's the first use of the word gospel as a verb in the English language, according to the OED. My first book discussed this only in the footnotes in a rather covert way. One of the purposes of writing this new book was to bring out this argument. And indeed, I have an extended comparison of Nietzsche and Shakespeare in the book on just this issue. And the point I make is that whereas Nietzsche saw Christianity as the force that subverted the Roman Empire, Shakespeare sees the corruption of the empire as the precondition for the rise of Christianity. That's the claim I'd make, and I think it's a historically plausible claim. That without the weakening of the nobility, so that even an Octavius could come to say that, "O noble weakness, Christianity could not have prevailed in the Roman Empire."
So Shakespeare is living in a Christian country. It's no longer a pagan antiquity. Does he think that the tragedy of Rome has lessons for his own time? Would he have thought that? And if so, what?
Well, yes. I mean, the lesson of Shakespeare is that from the Roman Republic is that republican life is superior as political life, but republics can corrupt themselves by empire, and we tend to project nation states back into ancient times. France was just emerging as the first nation state in the world in Shakespeare's day. Shakespeare lived in a world of empires, the two greatest being the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire, and that meant the Spanish Empire.
Some say that England was as much a nation at that point as France.
I think that would be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And
Queen Elizabeth and the Armada, she sort of appeals to her people.
that's national. I mean, again, we'd have to get into a argument here about the definition of the nation state. Here I follow Martin van Creveld in this, I think, wonderful book, The Rise and Fall of the Nation State. Nation state is bureaucracy. There's got to be, there's got to be continuity of government when the head changes. And that was not true in England, and it was just barely emerging in France at that time. Really, the nation state is first theorized by Baudin in France, and then by Hobbes after Shakespeare. Anyway, I don't want to get into a big debate over that, but England thought of itself as an empire. It's so, you go look at the title of Queen Elizabeth. I mean, she's Queen of Britain, Wales, Ireland, France, and Jerusalem. I mean, that's in her title. They may have removed it from the title today for this Queen Elizabeth, but England was thinking of itself as a would-be empire at that time, and I think Shakespeare had some cautionary sense of that, although I think he backed the British conquest of France, for example. He celebrates that in Henry V. And again, I hesitate. I think of Shakespeare as theoretical rather than practical. He's trying to understand the human condition. And to do that, he went back and wanted to understand the Romans, because they're so important in history and seem to manifest an aspect of humanity more fully than anyone else had. And I think he analyzes the Republic to understand why that was so. And when my first book was called Republic and Empire, one of the changes in the new book is I came to understand that as polis and empire, or ancient city and empire, I think as the twilight of the ancient world, I think Shakespeare understood that around the year 1, the human condition undergoes a fundamental transformation with the disappearance of the ancient city as a unit of community, and that we entered the world of empire, which is a world of cosmopolitan communities, communities with ever-expanding boundaries, with a very looser definition of citizenship. And I mean, I have an essay on Anti-Cleopatra and globalization in my book, because I think Romanization anticipates the whole problematic of globalization as we have it. And I think, in a way, Anti-Cleopatra for Shakespeare showed how we got from the ancient city in Rome to the world Shakespeare lived in. And the one thing that's missing in Anti-Cleopatra is Christianity, but it's coming. And it's coming through a preparatory transformation in the Roman aristocracy itself, which leads, for example, Cleopatra to say, "'Tis paltry to be Caesar." Where did that come from? The idea, be Caesar, that's the greatest thing in the world and this is a Christian revaluation, a proto-Christian revaluation of what it means to be great. And the nobleness of life is to do thus. It's not to be Caesar, it's to devote yourself to love.
Be a splendidly realized individual.
Well,
in the erotic sense.
Yes.
But in other senses, is this about individualism too?
Yes, it is about the emergence of greatness independent of a community. And there's a strong spiritual component in it. And that's why Antony envisaged he and Cleopatra in an afterlife where everyone will worship them. And Cleopatra has a dream of Antony when he's a universal god being worshipped by both sides of the world. It's really very daring on Shakespeare's part. I will grant you that.
Last big question. Do you think it has a lesson for our own time?
Well, yes. I mean, here, the corruption of the regime is a great theme of the Roman plays, and a regime straying from its original constitution. And I think I've said enough to say how there are lessons here that no regime lasts forever, and that it can gradually drift from the principles that originally made it work. And I think the comparisons are odious, as Sancho Panza says, and the comparison should be obvious at that point. And in general, I mean, I set it up so the great contrast in the Roman plays is being a citizen in the Republic and a subject in the Empire. And I think Shakespeare's admiration for the Republic, at least as a political institution, is that it gave everybody some feeling of participation in political life. Not equal, because the plebeians have a relatively circumscribed role, but they have a role. And there's the sense that they are all citizens, and that human agency is still the cornerstone of the Republic, so that Cassius famously says, the fault of Brutus is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. In the Empire, everybody needs an astrologer, almost literally. They're now thinking the stars determine things, and there's a profound sense of the loss of human agency. They are now subjects to an emperor. They are not citizens in a republic. And one of the great ways Shakespeare analyzed that is the willingness of the plebeians to sell their birthright for bread and circuses, and the notion that the political community must take care of you, and that freedom is no longer the primary value. I mean, within my own lifetime, I've seen the kind of rallying power of the word freedom just decline in the country. What politician would get up and say the most important thing is freedom? The change in rhetoric is quite extraordinary. I think Shakespeare wonders whether people really want freedom or whether they want to be taken care of. And that's in a way the overarching theme of these Roman plays.
Well, I guess we can hope that Shakespeare continues to be taught and understood.
Those are two separate things, by the way, but yes, I'll go for both of them, but we got to have both together.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for talking to me.